pleasure to be here. I'm having a fantastic time visiting the Bank of Chile. Lovely to be here. I'm learning a lot of things and I'm meeting a lot of very interesting people. One of the things I've learned from many of you is Central Bank of Chile makes quite a distinction between what seems to be called directed research and non-directed research. I'm sure you're all aware of this distinction. This is quite interesting because this is my first attempt for 25 years to do directed research. So it came about because Giacomo, who used to be my PhD student in some prehistoric times, approached me and said they were interested in working on exactly this topic. And they offered a contract. It was pre-pandemic. I thought, wouldn't it be great to go to Frankfurt and have lots of beers with Giacomo and talk with equally exciting people there at the European Central Bank? Yeah, why not do it? The pandemic hit. All the European Central Bank staff fled to Frankfurt. Giacomo went back to Sardinia. And so it took us 4 years or so to get to this point. But this is what we are offering. It was actually Massimo Rostagno was the director of the directed research. So you can see where this came about. It's just out as an ECB working paper, number 2,697 currently. So my first ECB working paper was number 28. They've done quite a lot since then. I got one in the thousands or something, but I think there's 3 of them. So let me talk you through what question they directed us to think about. Oh, good. No, yeah, good, excellent. So they were interested in when the central bank moves the policy rate, actors in financial markets are going to do stuff to react to that, and it will pass through to the yield curve somehow. And they were interested in how those interactions work. Do the strategic decisions and actions of private investors, how do they affect how the policy rate gets into the yield curve and then ultimately into the macroeconomy? Behind this, I think, a concern that if you read a very, very famous econometric paper by Ellison, they say that, well, actually, because you have these strategic investors in the market, when you change the interest rate, you get a less than 1-for-1 pass-through into the yield curve. And the idea is actually if you cut the interest rate, so we know that rates are going to fall. So think long rates are going to fall. They argue that, well, when the long rate falls, there is some preferred habitat investor who goes, well, the yields have fallen, I don't want this thing. And so they will reduce their demand for it. If they reduce their demand for it, that's going to reduce the price, but it's going to partly push up the yield again. So if that story is correct, then it will be that even though you cut the interest rate, you get pass through to the yield curve. Whereas there's a whole set of people, Hansen and Stein being particular here, who go, no, it goes the other way. Actually, if you cut the rates and then they cut the long rate, there's going to be some preferred habitat investor who actually goes, because the rate's gone down, I would want more of that. And I'm going to tell you more of a story for why that might happen, what might be the mechanism behind that. But you can see immediately that if that was to happen, then if you manage to cut rates, these preferred habitat investors are going to want to more of these. And if they want to have more of these, they're going to push up the price of that, which will actually make the yield fall even more. So you get an amplification channel if this is true. So it's really going to matter what these preferred habitat investors are doing, what their strategic motives are, what their strategic actions are going to be. And I think it's directed research. It's like an hide behind directed research, and Massimo gets all the blame. Why on earth are you doing this? But it's directed in the sense of we want to understand this as well. And if, central banks want to understand, even if you're not particularly innovative. It's going to be a theoretical paper, but central bankers, we resist a few plots of data. So this is just a motivating plot, which is showing who was holding government bonds between 2014 and 2021. What kind of institution was holding government bonds? So on the left-hand side, you've got insurance companies and pension funds. And on the right-hand side, you've got monetary financial institutions, essentially banks. And I'm plotting the share of long bonds held by these particular institutions. So if we go over here, we've got bond prices. So we know between 2014 and 2021, yields are falling, so bond prices are going up. So in both these pictures, time goes in that direction. And you can see that the insurance funds are holding a progressively greater share of long bonds, and banks are holding a smaller share. No causality, nothing more here than really something was happening. As those yields fell, the bonds started to be accumulated more held by insurance funds and pension funds rather than these monetary and financial institutions. Which, to go back to this first question, saying that's probably got something to do with what the strategic actions of a bank would be, what the strategic actions of an insurance fund. Yeah.
But that's only long bonds, right? Not, so I think the long terms probably because that's short bond prices. So that's the whole long bonds. What happened to the short bonds?
Okay, fine. I don't dispute that there are other dimensions we can look at. These are all bonds of over a year, so they're not even particularly long in that way. I can see that there's lots of empirical dimensions which you might want to look at. I'm being selective. I'm picking one that I find is interesting. It's not an empirical paper, but imagine if there was nothing here, then you'd go, well, so what? This seems to be behaving exactly the same as this. Whereas, if anything, this is doing something very different to this. So it looks like there's two agents in financial markets that do different stuff. Okay, so here's what you're going to get today. You're going to get some micro-founded model of this preferred habitat demand. And I'm going to put that in a bond market, which is going to have these insurance funds. It's going to have arbitrage others. They're going to be like the banks, and it's going to have bond supply. This is something I hope goes down well with central bankers. I'm going to do it in such a way that I'm going to end up with an affine term structure. So it's going to become practical, easy to handle. And it's going to be an arbitrage for yield curve. We really don't like these models which we've written ourselves in the past, where somehow short and long bonds are imperfect substitutes over and above their return characteristics. So we'll come on to the explanation in a second, but we wrote a paper where we just like to have a combination of short and long bonds because they have a preference for long bonds. That doesn't feel like the right way of thinking about yield curve when these are extremely deep markets and where you should be able to arbitrage across maturities. We're then going to put that in general equilibrium. So there's going to be household terms and monetary policy. What we're going to get, we're going to be on a Hansen and Stein type world where the behavior of private investors is going to amplify monetary policy actions. It's going to be, an insurance fund is going to be wanting to increase their holdings of bonds when the yields fall. We'll go to why that happens. It's going to be especially true in a low interest rate environment. You can see the history of our paper here. 4 years ago, this was a particular part of the directed research, that how would this work when interest rates are low? If you were to direct this research now, I'm not sure whether that would be something you were particularly focused on. But it's okay. And then when you put this mechanism in equilibrium, it's going to get even more
working, but amplification in the first bullet point, still paid like as a result of the theory, or it's something quantitative, basically the result of the parameters of the model.
So this bit here, it's going to be a function of the theory. The theory is going to put a restriction on the sign of parameters, which is going to make this happen. Okay. Yeah, Mark.
I get that this is a theoretical paper, but let me go back to the empirical motivation.
There's always one.
Yeah. So, I mean, the plots you showed us show that there is some strategic. I mean, different actors in the financial market are behaving differently. But with regards to this amplification or dampening, is there empirical evidence? I mean, shouldn't that be I mean, there's some theories say that investors dampen monetary policy shocks. Some papers say they amplify. Is there empirical research on this?
Yes. And I would say most of the empirical research is for the amplification. So you think of all that stuff of reach for yield, search for yield, hunt for duration. That tends to be of that. I should, I guess, have a slide in here, but yes, that. Yeah, I should say things over here about the biopsy paper, and but I think that seems to be the evidence of that empirically looks to be. This is actually a good place to stop if anybody online, if there's anybody online wants to come in. I can see somebody online, yeah. But, yeah, is it Carlos?
Yeah.
Hi, Carlos.
I'm here following.
Yes. Right. There's related literature, and nowadays the habit when you give a presentation is always to put this kind of slide up that you pay homage to all these people, but you never explain really what's going on because you all know what these papers are. So I'm going to do that. Imperfect. As it's to do body and it's such that coding and stuff that really motivates all the QE. There's various papers on the relation between policy rates and premium, and then there's a whole set of papers on asset purchase program. This paper is not about asset purchase, not about QE, but it's very, very easy to generalize what I'm doing to thinking about QE. So I'm going to be talking about changing interest rates and whether that gets or dampens by the strategic actions in the market. But you can easily think of, suppose you make a QE intervention, does that get, what does that get in the market? And it's just the same mechanism. It's almost trivial to show the same thing going on, because QE is going to move, say, long yields. If it cuts the long yield, then all that thing that I'm talking about will kick in. As an insurance fund, do you want to hold more or less of those bonds because the yield has fallen? It does not matter what forward the yield to fall. So this one's by far the
One short question. So the setup of Allianz and Vila will be embedded in your model, like the.
If you understand the Allianz and Vila, going to put some foundations on one of the things that they just say exists. It will turn out that those foundations have implications for that relationship that make it a little bit different. But that's exactly. Okay, let's go. And there's only Carlos to wait for here, so I can see he's paying attention still. Yeah, poor guy. He's not wearing a mask though. I'm getting worried. Everybody is wearing a mask. Right, so now I'm just going to get on with it. So I'm going to have to put some frictions in my economy, otherwise I don't have friction. We all. And the friction is going to work as follows. When you're a household, you have to save with a financial intermediary. You don't have access to bond markets yourself. You can take your money to the bank will be able to pass that through into bond markets. But you can't yourself actually invest in bond markets. So the financial intermediary is going to receive the deposits from the bank, from the household. It's then going to pass on those funds to the insurance funds and to arbitrageurs. There's going to be a friction at that point that says, every time this financial intermediary passes money to the arbitrageurs, it has to buy an annuity. So it can't give all the money to the arbitrageurs. It has to give at least some of the money to the annuity provider. It's a friction, and we could discuss whether we like that friction or not. You have to have some friction again to make this big work. If they could pass everything to the arbitrageurs, they would like to. The arbitrageurs are as near as having this same objective as the household. We like to interpret this friction as a risk-adjusted capital requirement. So there are people with infinitely more expertise here about potential regulation and Basel II and Basel III. But it's like, if you are exposing your capital risk to the arbitrageurs, then you have to give some of your money to holding these annuities. That could be a governmental Basel type thing, or it could be the markets. As a household, you wouldn't give your money to a financial intermediary, which you know is going to give all the money to this very risky arbitrageur, and you go to Monte Carlo and put all the money on red. So that's the basic friction we're going to be introducing. Let's talk about what this insurance fund is going to be doing. This is where the action is. If you're like a friend over here who knows the Banco Seminarios, there's going to be all the Banco Seminarios stuff, and there's going to be the insurance fund. So the insurance fund is going to be buying and selling perpetual annuities. And those annuities are going to pay a coupon C that decreases over time. Some of you may have already seen these. Woodford uses these as a trick. There's another paper here that uses it. So the idea is, because these coupons are decreasing over time, you have some control over the duration of the bond. The duration is how long it takes to get your money back. Well, if they are decreasing fast or slow, is going to affect how long it takes you to get your money back. So they're buying and selling these annuities that are paying coupons that reduce at G. And they're going to be pricing up these annuities on their balance sheet using some benchmarking. So they've got this string of commitments, liabilities that they need to pay to the infinite future. Okay, they're decreasing. But the present discounted value of those is going to be according to some benchmark yield. So it's not like I'm going to put the first coupon at the 1 year rate, and I put the second coupon at the 2 year rate, the third coupon at the third, and so on. No, they're all going to be discounted by this yield. So that could be like a regulatory requirement that you have to discount your liabilities with, say, a 10-year bond rate, something like that. Right. Let's think of what the insurance fund is doing. It's going to have liabilities on its balance sheet. because it's got all these payments, and we look at the present discounted value of those, it comes out of this. It's going to be a function of what the yield is that you use to price them, and then it's going to be a function of how fast they drop. But then there's also that liability will have a duration, and you do the little calculation, and it comes out like this. So this is the duration of your liabilities. As an insurance fund, you've got this stream. The present value of that stream is going to depend on the yield. So as the yield moves up and down, it's going to be making your liabilities get bigger and smaller. But as the yield moves up and down, it's also going to affect the sensitivity of your liabilities to yield changes. And going to model insurance funds as wanting to match the duration of their assets to the duration of their liabilities. Let me say that in a different way. If the interest rate changes, it's going to affect my liabilities. As an insurance fund, that's worrying for me, because my liabilities on my balance sheet are subject to the interest rate risk. But what I can do as an insurance fund is I can hold government bonds, and we know government bonds react to the yield. So if we're clever, we can have the right amount of government bonds so that if there's a change in the interest rate, my liabilities will change, but my assets will change as well. So like both sides of my balance sheet can move in tandem. That means whatever equity or money that I've got remaining is not a risk. So it's like a immunization strategy that says the insurance fund can avoid worrying about changes in interest rates affecting their liabilities by having an asset side of its balance sheet that moves the same way. And to do that, you really want the duration of your assets to match the duration of your liabilities. You want a smaller duration gap as possible. Yeah.
The coupons here are.
At the moment, because I'm in a partial equilibrium world, so you can think of them as nominal if you want.
No, I mean if they're nominal and the shock to minus of the effects, I imagine there's a revaluation of that.
Yeah, but there's still an interest rate risk. That's all I need at this point. All I need is when you change the interest rate, it actually affects the value of my liabilities. So unless there's somehow nominal and the interest rate is exactly offset by changes in expected inflation, you will get some. Okay. Bottom line behavior, this insurance fund is going to be demanding government bonds to manage its exposure to duration risk. To make sure its balance sheet doesn't get horribly out of balance when there's changes.
One question?
Yeah.
I noticed that there are many different breakthroughs to do either of these two things that I'm going to say, but you could either manage your assets, like to manage the duration of liabilities, but you could also change the composition of your liabilities to basically to increase other type of debt that is of longer duration, so that the share of liabilities with shorter durations is smaller.
So let me answer that. So in two parts. So this insurance fund have no control over its liability. Yeah. Because it only issues that certain type of liability, and the financial intermediary is required to buy exactly that type of liability. That's half the story. But you're right, I've not said anything yet about how you would actually manage the asset side of your, and this is going to be an important thing. So I just said that we know that government bonds are exposed to interest rate risk, and so there must be a way of holding a bond or holding all bonds such that you manage to minimize this risk. So I think that'll be part of the answer to your figure. I didn't say anything that you have to buy long bonds here. You know, to do this. You could buy short, or you could buy a portfolio, or whatever. I'll come to that. But that's almost like part of the story of you don't have to match it in an exact way. Okay, good. This is going to address exactly this now. So my insurance fund, it wants to hold government bonds because it wants exposure to interest rate risk. Because it sees its liabilities are exposed to interest rate risk, so it wants these assets to be exposed to interest rate risk. Demands bonds to close the duration. But what's going to happen here is there's going to be these arbitrageurs out there. We haven't talked about them yet. But they're going to be there, and they're going to be acting so that the yield curve is going to be arbitrage free. What that means is the market price of risk is going to be the same at all different maturities. That actually means that, in response to this question, the insurance fund actually becomes indifferent to what maturity bonds it holds. What it wants is exposure to interest rate risk. So it could hold a few long bonds. And we know long bonds move a lot with the interest rate. And so that could be the right thing to do to immunize your balance sheet. Or it could hold a whole stack of short-term bonds, which don't move very much, but you hold a lot of them. Both of those would do the job of immunizing your balance sheet. And so actually this insurance fund becomes indifferent to what maturity is held. So we're going to come back to this a few times when we come back to Ellison and Vila again, because this is not specific to us, it's also in Ellison and Vila. The preferred habitat in Ellison and Vila is a preference for exposure to interest rate risk. A preference for duration risk on your asset side. It isn't actually a preference for 10-year bonds, which is what people usually think of as what this means. It's yes, they prefer 10-year bonds, but they only really care about risk management that those 10-year bonds give you. And they would be quite happy to take 5-year bonds. They would have to take a bit more of them. But because the yield curve is arbitrage free, it's mathematically just the same, whether you hold a lot of small bonds, short bonds, whether you hold a lot of, I mean, they hold a few long bonds. That's handy for me because I can talk you through now, without loss of generality, let's just have this insurance fund holding the maturity of bonds that's the one that used to price liabilities. It's without loss of generality, but it makes the math a lot easier. They could hold a portfolio of bonds, but actually they could just hold 10-year bonds. Because they think about it, if the liabilities are priced up at the yield on a 10-year bond, and you have your assets in 10-year bonds, they're both going to move. You won't be able to perfectly match the thing. So when the interest rate moves, you do get actually bigger liabilities to your assets will diverge. Because both are different non-linear functions of the yield. But you'll at least minimize the gaps. So we can what does that imply? Insurance funds are going to increase their demand for bonds as yields fall. There's a mathematical equation, which itself is not super interesting, but think what's going to happen. As yields fall, liabilities get bigger, the interest rate risk in those liabilities gets bigger, and so I need to hold more bonds. I'm affecting the duration of my liabilities. I have to find matching with in the duration of my assets. This is beautiful. It's so beautiful, it can't be anything I've done. And indeed, it comes from a different derivation. You get the same thing in a paper by these guys, which one of the et al. Is this guy, Hume Sheen, which, he kind of knows a bit about how these things work. And he has a paper called The Home for Duration. That paper has a lot of that empirics that you were interested in. And it's kind of like micro-empirics of seeing how these financial institutions react to changes. We can also be like macro-empirics of how the yield curve moves. What that's going to mean then is that the preferred habitat demand is going to be amplifying, and as yields get lower, it's going to be more and more amplifying.
Sorry,
Yeah.
can I make a question? Can people hear me well?
Yes.
Okay. I wanted to ask something. So these intermediaries in the preferred habitat, these pension funds, one could think that they are proxies for consumers of different ages, right? Could one obtain the same results with an overlapping generations model in which you have, I don't know, old, middle-aged, and young?
Great question, Carlos. Let me answer it on the next page. Because it's a good question, but the answer is even better. It's going to be no. You'll see why. Come back to me again if you're not happy with the answer I'm going to give you on the next page. Let's take that relationship and non-linearize it. So it's a relationship between market value of holdings of bonds of benchmark maturity and the yield on that maturity. So it comes out. I have a demand function, which is the market value of your market holdings. It's a constant plus a linear function of the yield on that maturity. And I can work out analytic expression for the constant and for the slope, and the slope is negative. Yeah. It's negative because when the yield goes up, let's put the yield go down. When the yield goes down, then we know that the present value slowly, we know that the interest rate sensitivity of it is increasing, therefore you have to hold more of those bonds. So it's negative because the insurance fund is growing the duration gap, and it's very negative in a low interest rate environment. As promised to Carlos, look at Bayern's and B, and they run with this phi being greater than or equal to 0. And they do it in an OLT model. That's why I said it was a good answer to what you're doing. Because in an OLT model, you're deciding, how much of my endowment when I'm young or middle-aged do I want to save for my retirement. In that type of model, if the yield goes down, I consume more when I'm young. I save less for when I'm old, under regularity conditions. So the better answer, you can get that relationship in an OLT model, but kind of the sign goes the other way. Now, obviously, you can probably cook a particular OLT model with lots of generations, I think. But you're right that there are. Final bit on this slide is this thing, which is a looking glass. Looking glass is an old world formula. And so this inspired time ago the title of the paper, that it's through the looking glass, because if you read Vianas and Vila and you've understood this, actually no, you need to get the looking glass out and everything's going to go in the opposite direction to what they did, because this is negative rather than positive. And so we already said, rather than dampen, it's going to amplify. So 4 years of directed research, we ended up with this being negative rather than positive. But that's fine. Okay, let's complete the model. What we're going to do is I'm going to parachute in this type of habitat into the biomes. So at this point, it's actually, I'm telling you the biomes and be the model, because they just propose this with sign positive. I'm going to propose this and say these two actually depend on steady state. If you log linearize around a high yield, you have a small number here. If you log linearize around a low yield, you're going to get that much. I think we're doing fine. Arbitrages, not super interesting, other than that they are going to ensure you have an arbitrage-free term structure, because the arbitrageurs can invest across the whole maturity structure that's available. So they're going to maximize the one period portfolio return. You're going to give them some money, and they're going to invest in all different maturities of bonds. They have limited risk-bearing capacity, so they can't take a portfolio that's very risky. This is standard mean variance stuff, such that the return on that portfolio depends on the portfolio weights, and the portfolio weights after 1, and the returns are taken on the. This is all very, very standard. This is a little bit less standard, because we're thinking about government bonds supply. This is not in buyouts. They don't have this part. Not the primary focus of the paper. That's maybe a little bit cheap. It's not the primary focus. It's kind of important what's going on here. So what we're going to do is try to do the simplest thing we can and say you adjust bond supply so that the market value at each maturity is fixed. So this would be like the market value of outstanding government debt at, say, the 10-year maturity. It's going to be a fixed proportion of the total market value of government debt. So imagine this is going to give you the whole total market value. It's going to be divided up according to these gamma coefficients. Now, why do I say that's important? Not. Suppose the interest rate falls. I just told you that the insurance funds are going to increase their demand for bonds. But without loss of generality, they can do that at the benchmark maturity. Now, if the government just agreed to supply extra bonds on that maturity, they could neutralize the fact that the insurance funds are requiring more bonds. And it would all wash out, and we'd lose our mechanism. But okay, the interest rate has fallen, the insurance funds want more bonds, we'll just give some more bonds, we'll issue more bonds of that maturity. So it's important for us that when the insurance fund actually wants to have more bonds of this benchmark maturity, they do become scarce. And so we engineer that. Well, the government is not going to completely satisfy your demand maturity by maturity. It's going to give you enough bonds for your aggregate bonds, but it's not going to be exactly the right maturity that you want. Which is, a little bit like should the central bank go out and buy government bonds of a certain maturity? If the government then issues more bonds of that maturity, you just neutralize the QE because there'd be no scarcity of those bonds. So it's a similar thing going on here that I don't want to neutralize the effects of these insurance funds just by the government always giving the insurance funds what they that's what it's doing. Government insurance is going to buy back and reissue the entire debt stock each period. So lots of paper students. It is tractability rather than trying to keep track of all the variable maturity structure. So you just buy it all back and reissue. That doesn't really matter. Another little flag that says it will be quite easy to put some QE here. So I could have some shocks on this equation, or I could have some systematic here. So I could say, yeah, this is true, but this actually responds to interest rates or something. We could do that. So maybe we should. It's a cheap thing to do. It comes to almost. Okay, I guess we don't need a thick stop given this. Carlos seems confident enough. He's going to share really when he wants to have.
There's.
Okay. Let's have a thick stop in with him.
All right, this is like 30 people.
Ah, okay.
I can only see Cairo, but there are many more.
I think it's the way Carlos is acting. He's just making himself very, very big on my screen. Yeah. And I can't see it. So hello to all the other 25 people. Yeah. Okay.
Yes. I studied well that Boer and Nicolini paper because I was their student back in the days of the PhD.
Sophia, you wanted to ask?
Yes, I don't know if it's the right time, but I will ask it anyway. So going back a couple of slides to where you showed where the difference is, can we do that? Idea? Completely ignorant of this literature. So let me ask. So it seems to me that it depends a lot on where the demand is coming. Right? These guys, they have this. They want to ensure the duration because they have this contract in which they have to provide coupons, the decrease of the time. That's where it comes from. But if you think about banks, maybe the demand is different and it comes closer to an old model, right? Because the banks are, the liabilities are short term, the assets that they hold is long term. So could it be that if you think about different intermediaries, that parameter would actually be positive? And that comes back to your motivation, which you had insurance. And because the insurance companies are increasing their position in long-term bonds, you're getting an amplification. You would think of amplification right now. This is not necessarily the case all the time.
So as always, Sophia understands perfectly what's going on. Introduce it very public that I don't understand, but yes, John. But to take one step back, by Emerson Vera just saying there exists a demand of this type. That's really what the paper just saying. There's a linear demand function by a preferred habitat investor. This is appendix F or something, and it's incredibly specific to get that. So I'm guessing this has come from a referee who's gone like, okay, you did that and you did positive, and they kind of give some foundations, and there's these foundations, and it's a very special model. I mean, these are these know what they're doing, so there's no criticism in that way, but it's a very specific.
So they assume it is positive, and then they provide some.
Yes, it goes that way rather than let's write down the OLG model and then having done that thing. So that's what they start from. And when you see people who sign by Emerson Villa, they do it to write that down, essentially, because that gives you the behaviour of this preferred habitat investor. But then you're absolutely right. We could argue about whether the science is positive or negative. I'm arguing that the insurance funds are giving negative. I don't know quite what to think of those banks because we have got these arbitrageurs in there who behave a little bit like banks. So one way to think about this is if you've got this agent who has a preference for duration risk management and an agent who doesn't, you get this kind of stuff. So yeah, to kind of overturn that feels quite a hard thing to do. Very good. We did that one. Oh yeah, we were just into so we can extend this to key. I made this assumption. I said is to make sure you're not just negating what the insurance fund wants. But it's actually quite nice because you can look at market clearing conditions. So this one is easy. This is the supply of bonds of maturity N, where N is not the benchmark bonds. That's got to be equal to the amount of money that the arbitrageurs have and the proportion that they spend on that particular maturity. At the benchmark maturity, the supply has got to be equal to the demand from the arbitrageurs plus the demand from the insurance fund. And remember the assumptions I made, every dollar that goes to the arbitrageur, you have to buy one of these annuities, and every annuity has got to be backed by this amount of bonds. So when you do market clearing, you then sum up over the different maturities, you play around, and because of the way I've set this up, actually our bond market equilibrium doesn't depend on the amount of money that's going to the arbitrageurs. So what you've got is you've got this macro finance world where what happens in the bond market is going to eventually, in general equilibrium, affect savings decisions and all that stuff that's going on in the economy. But the amount of saving that households make doesn't have an effect on the yield curve itself. To kind of wash that, which is it's a little bit like washing out the oil of that. But, and that helps us a lot for tractability. You've got only one direction that the yield curve is going to matter for the macroeconomy, that the macroeconomy is not going to directly matter for the yield curve. I mean, indirectly, because it's going to matter for what happens to the short rate and policy rate. One more hard slide, I think, and then it gets a bit easier. We start seeing pictures and we start seeing numbers. We can chill a bit before it gets harder again. As promised, that fine touch. So long bond prices are linear in a set of macro risk factors. X, T. We'll come to explain what those are. Also in equilibrium, the excess holding period returns on maturity N turns out to depend on this thing. So it depends on a coefficient, and then it depends on this, which people call the market price of risk. And you'll see if I change N here, I look at different maturities, this is going to change. But this is not. This is the sum across all F. So the market price of risk is the same at each point on the yield curve. It just loads in to the bond price with a different coefficient. This market price of risk is the duration risk borne by the arbitrageurs. Because the omegas are the arbitrageurs. These are the elasticity of bond prices with respect to the macro risk. So a long way round is saying that the yield curve here depends on how much duration risk arbitrageurs are having to. How much duration risk is held by arbitrageurs is obviously then a function of how much duration risk is in their supply and how much the insurance funds are wanting to hold.
Something MMS, so they choose this optimally,
They choose what?
the residual duration risk.
Yes. Well, yeah, let me say this. So the insurance funds are choosing how much duration risk. There's the duration risk supply for the bonds, and this has to be the residual. And because these arbitrageurs are optimizing, it has to be that the market prices adjust in such a way that they want to hold this amount of.
And there's any idea why, if there is any, so why don't they hold like zero risk, duration risk? Is it too expensive for them? So they could do, theoretically, they could match the duration on both sides, right?
The insurance funds.
Yes.
No, because the yeah, but right, so there you're saying you're closing the duration gap.
Yes.
Yeah, but you're still exposed to some duration risk at that point. And this is because like the liabilities are going to be affected by the yield. The assets are going to be affected by the yield. But those relationships are two nonlinear relationships that are not the same. So if the yield curve drops, your liabilities are going to get bigger. You can hold the portfolio of bonds so that your assets get bigger, but it's not about the margin right at the beginning. It's an imperfect hedge against duration risk.
This is like the minimum that they could get.
Yes. So they are exposed to duration risk because the only way you can ensure the duration risk in a perpetual liability is to have a perpetual asset. But there's no perpetual assets out there. So you're holding some sort of bond, but that will be reacting differently. But you kind of do so the first derivative is that, to first order, you manage to get no duration risk, but then to second order and third order, of course you get. But final bit that I do probably get to the numbers. So if it's all going to depend on the residual duration risk provided by the arbitrageurs, it's all going to depend on the duration risk borne by the insurance fund. And like I said before, then it doesn't matter how they structure that. It doesn't matter whether they hold long bonds or short bonds. It's how much duration risk exposure they want. And that's true in biomass. That's not just here. But it's all about this preferred habitat. I could write it like that, but there will be other versions of that give exactly the same yield curve behavior, where instead of N star, they've got a different. So there's actually nothing special about N star in biomass and VLAN. And I think it took me a long time to understand. So it's not a preferred habitat in the sense that 10-year bonds really interesting in themselves. It's the fact that 10-year bonds give you exposure to interest rate risk matters. And you could take a different portfolio and do exactly.
But the B, you go back to the.
Yeah. This one, yeah.
There appears there. Is that related to what the government is supplying of each material?
Yes, so it's going to be affected. I mean, it eventually tells you this is the responsiveness of bond prices to these macroeconomic risk factors. And of course, that's going to be partly when the risk factor changes, what does government want to. Okay. We're in partial equilibrium. We're doing well. And so, I'm going to get to general equilibrium. Let's take partial equilibrium. And so, in partial equilibrium, which I absolutely less partial equilibrium, so I'm okay with that. I could just make the short wave follow an exogenous process. And so then the yield curve is going to price up shocks to that exogenous process. And we can look at shocks and see what happens to them. It's going to be set up in this slightly familiar way, but it's basically there's two types of shocks. There's monetary policy shocks, which are the epsilons, and they pass through immediately to the short rate, and then through this phi coefficient, they dissipate. So they become like AR1 shocks, very standard. But I'm also going to have what I call a future path shock, which is a shock that has no impact immediately, but is a promise that interest rates will be lower in the future. So I'm a bit nervous, especially when it's being recorded, to call this a forward guidance shock, but that's the idea. I'm a bit nervous because, in forward guidance, these are very long horizons. And I don't know quite how much you promise to keep interest rates low for the next 10 years in this house. But the reason this is doing it is because if I look at a monetary policy shock, it kind of dissipates. And so like in DSG models, the long end of the yield curve hardly moves. So you get very little action if you have this monetary policy shock. So you shock it and the benchmark yield is going to move just a little bit, and that's going to make the insurance funds change their demand for bonds a little bit, but there's going to be very little action. Whereas if it's this kind of future path shock, there's going to be a lot of action at the long end of the yield curve, not much action at the short end. Again, clients can do this exercise. They don't do it like this, don't they? They do it like this. So let's put some numbers there. There's a whole set of numbers in the table over here, calibrating to all sorts of things, which I don't want to bore you with. This is a theory paper, so it's this is a numerical example rather than being a particular. I mean, we try our best to make it. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at this exogenous process, and then I'm going to change this mu. So in a low interest rate environment, you can imagine mu is 0, and so these monetary policy shocks are going to knock you around 0. So like these. Whereas in a high interest rate environment, this mu might be 2%, 4%, 2%, 8%, and so on. Yeah, we will have to think what the appropriate bounds on this are now. An earlier version of the paper, we had these going up to 5 or something, and the ECB was horrified at this idea. You would even talk about interest rates being 5. That may change. So, go up to 2010, put that through the model, you can work out what the benchmark yields are, and you can work out what the coefficients of that non-linearized preferred habitat demand is. Constant, positive, but then this is the slope of the preferred habitat demand. As you see, they're all negative here. This is always the insurance fund seeing that interest rates falling, wanting to increase their holdings. But the lower the stronger the reaction, which is what as interest rates get lower, present value of liabilities is very large. The sensitivity of that changes in the interest rate gets larger. So this is working. Let's hit this thing by a future path shock. This is a commitment that in the future interest rates are going to be lower than they were before. Look at the middle. This is the standard expectations hypothesis. This is the yield curve. This is not an impulse response function. Yeah, that's right. But they're not. And so this is the yield curve. So the yield curve drops down. It's the expectations hypothesis. And it doesn't drop down at short rates because it's a future path shock. Nothing's happening to the short rate. But then at long rates, it drops quite a bit because it's integrating up all those lower than normal short rates. It's going to drop. Suppose the world was according to the expectations hypothesis, you'd have that then rates drop, yields drop at all maturities. But now we inject our mechanism that there's the insurance fund. So the insurance fund is seeing that the yield on 10-year bonds, say that's their benchmark maturity, has fallen. And we know that then they need to increase their holdings of 10-year bonds. So they're going to buy bonds, they're going to push the price of 10-year bonds up, and the yield is going to fall even further. So that's what we are seeing here, that the yield actually falls more than you would expect through the expectations hypothesis. And the different colours are for different steady state interest rates. So the blue one is a low interest rate environment. We know then that the insurance funds are more sensitive, so you get a bigger fall. The yellow is the least, they're at the highest interest rate environment. This is 5 here. So already the slope is not so dramatic. And it's coming through a term premium effect. So the term premium is actually falling because of this behavior of the insurance fund. As Stein quite nicely called, it's like a recruitment channel. So you've got the interest rates, and then the insurance funds come and help you cut it even further. You can see how in a QE sense, this really feels like a recruitment. Suppose you did this by some house QE, you cut things. You buy assets as a central bank, and because interest rates fall, the insurance fund can buy some assets as well. So it helps you out. Recruitment.
So if you were to interpret this as forward guidance,
Yeah.
if you were to interpret this, you would be saying that forward guidance works better in a low interest rate environment.
Yeah.
It doesn't work that much because I when it comes to look at the yellow.
Yeah, I mean it works. Whatever.
Not by this channel.
Yeah. So I mean that just works by the fact that forward guidance says interest rates are going to be lower. But the lower our interest rates, the more kick you will get out of your forward guidance over and above what you would expect. Okay. Monetary policy, it's the same story, but as I said, monetary policy shocks, they dissipate quite quickly, and so the scale of these actions is much smaller. Here you're getting, you could see the gap here. Here, but that's just these big shocks. That's not changing the supply of duration risk very much in the market, or that's the demand for duration risk. Okay, we've done before we go.
May I ask you for a different type of comparative, a different type of exercise?
Yeah.
Suppose that for some reason, some exogenous reason, the participation in the market of insurance plus the pension funds get larger or smaller. What is going to happen to the same pictures?
So the short answer to that is, I guess I could show, so I've not done that exercise. I could imagine shocking the requirement to buy these things. So, I give money to the average treasurer, you have to buy one of these annuities that's got a certain profile. So I suppose I could shock that. And that would be a way of changing. Clearly, if these insurance funds are a smaller proportion of the market, all these effects are going to be smaller. So that's one way of it.
And they're going to collapse to what?
To the expectations. Yeah. I mean, you can't get away from it because that's what's happening to the sharp end.
Okay.
Okay, thanks. Right, so I'll whiz through this in 10 minutes. So far, we've had variance and VLAN, and I've changed the sign of a coefficient. Basically, fine. Let's be honest about this. That's what we've done. That wasn't our directed research proposal. It was to be able to put this in a general equilibrium model with so there's two problems here. I haven't said anything about the pricing of these annuities yet. I've just said you have to buy them. And so because you buy them, this insurance fund has to get a hold of these assets. I haven't said anything about how much things would be priced. And then whatever I do on the general needs to give me a process for the short-term interest rate that looks like that. Because that's what's taken as given in bond markets. That's sort of uninteresting. The way to do that is you kind of want a macro model that has very little propagation in it. UK's a macro model, perfect. Purely forward-looking model, no propagation anyway. So that sort of solves that. I won't talk very much about that. This is more interesting because I think there's a mechanism. So let's think about this insurance fund. And it's issuing annuity, potentially buying them back at the end of the year. How much profit is it going to make? Well, it sells them at a certain price, and it can buy them back at market prices the next period. But these are decreasing coupon annuities, so they're worth less when you buy them back, because the coupons have already started to decrease. So you can make a capital gain in that you sell something for PTC and then you buy it back at whatever the prevailing market price is, but at 1 minus G factor, because it's already started to decrease. So that's one part of it. The other part is you have to pay the coupon. Third bit, you've got the money in because you've sold the annuity. You then have to go and buy those bonds. That's what's required for your duration management on your balance sheet. And so those bonds will pay you some return. It's not completely wasted money. You got those bonds to realize your balance sheet. But potentially there's some money left over. You sold for some price. You spent so much of it on those bonds. What are you going to do with that? We're going to assume that there is some outside opportunity available to the insurance fund where it can use that money. What we know about insurance funds is if you say you have to buy these bonds, they scream. And they say, I really don't want to buy these bonds. I don't like them. It's a constraint. It's not, I don't want. That must mean they've got some outside opportunity that some way they would be making money. I think that makes sense because otherwise, would they put the rest of the money into bonds or keep it in money? It must be they would use that to do something so they could take some equity investment. So you've got some investment in opportunity outside. What that means then is requiring them to close that duration gap is always going to be costly.
These investment opportunities are only available to
Yes.
households.
No. So this is but they are only available to the insurance fund, and they're not in any way subject to interest rate risk. So imagine if there was some interest rate risk in them, then your balance sheet would be a danger because those outside opportunities maybe. So these are safe, profitable things. Going to impose a zero profit condition so that the price of the annuity is such that in expectation these insurance funds make no profit. And doing that, you can then form a recursion here and you can work out what the price of the annuity will be that guarantees zero profit. Okay. Let's think now what happens when you hit this future path shock. The insurance fund sees that the interest rate, the yields have gone down. And because the yields have gone down, it has to buy more bonds. So the insurance fund increases bondholders close duration. But because it's spending more money on those bonds, it's got less money available to do those outside investment opportunities. It's screaming. I don't want to do this. I don't want to buy these bonds. And you go, no, that's the rule, that's the regulation. You have to do that. So then they're looking on the investment opportunities. That means their profitability is going to fall. If the profitability of their annuities falls, then by the zero profit condition, the price of them has to rise. All that ends up telling you that the return to the annuity must be falling. The annuity returns are dropping. So you can see here what happens to the price of the annuity. So when interest rates fall, the price has to rise because you're hitting the profitability of those insurance funds. And because of that, the returns of the annuity test. In some ways, this is a bit of a clunky mechanism, but it's getting at this idea that when interest rates fall, it's harder to run an insurance fund because you're exposed to more of this duration risk and you have to take these investments in assets to manage that duration risk. And that's taking assets away from something else you want to do with that money. And it's hitting your profitability. So you've got like a second channel going on here, which is to the profitability of these insurance funds. Okay. General equilibrium in 3 minutes. I can do that. Standard cases of foundation. A Phillips curve and all an equation. So which is what you've seen before. We really can't use it. It's going to be a first order approximation. And that's so I can get the equilibrium laws of motion that's coming out of the general equilibrium model consistent with that process for the short-term rate that I put into my bond pricing model. So, no real apologies. I think we could do second order approximation here. And then we'd have like it will be a fine quadratic. That feels like something I want a PhD student to do rather than me to do, but that feels like, yeah, there should be a fixed point that you could do it, but we'll do the first one. Households are going to smooth consumption and supply labour. The crucial thing is the interest rate in their Euler equation is going to be the rate that they get paid from the financial intermediary. So the return to saving. That return itself is going to be a function of how much they get from the arbitrageurs and how much they get from their annuities. So if you think you cut the interest rate, that's going to fall because the expectations hypothesis stuff is going to make it fall. But it's also going to fall because of that preferred habitat thing that says the insurance fund has to hold more of those assets, so that's going to push the interest rate down. And then because the profitability of these insurance funds has fallen, that's going to depress the return to annuities, and that's going to also enter here. That's clearly what the general equilibrium thing is doing. Now, the short rate, in terms of this, the short rate itself and this future path shock thing, is going to determine the short rate fixed by a household, And through those mechanisms I've just been talking to you through, the expectations hypothesis, the preferred habitat, the profitability of investment of insurance funds, all those are going to contribute to magnifying what's going to happen. Calvo price rigidity, Taylor rule, shocks to the Taylor rule are going to have exactly this AR2 process. And this is why I talked about no propagation in the New Keynesian model. Because we know that in the basic New Keynesian model, we're very forward-looking, everything is a function of the shocks. You know, inflation, output, whatever you do, they're all functions of the shocks. So if I have that kind of model, and then I have my shocks following that process, all the variables are going to be a function of those, that process. So the shock rate is going to follow the sun. I seem to have only got monetary policy shock left in here, but there's nothing interesting going on here, other than you're going to be getting amplification. So when you cut the shock rate, the return to saving is going to be falling by more for all those mechanisms I just told you. Actually, I mean, the monetary policy is sort of interesting because you get quite a lot of action here. Most of the action is coming from that profitability of the annuity funds. And because the return to saving falls so much more, you stimulate the cost. No surprise. The contribution here is to make all the algebra and things add up. But there's nothing new. If you understand that the pass-through is going to be stronger, then you're not going to be surprised. Not too bad. 1 minute over. God, I'll summarise, especially as this has been recorded. Somebody will zoom to the end and go. So we're arguing that you get amplification because of this liability. And that's more of a Hansen-Stein story, but for duration, reachable yield type of thing, a recruitment channel than what they show in. There's three things that's really nice about this. Is now you're going to get extra sensitivity of long rates to short rates. So the preferred habitat investor is going to be amplifying that stuff. And Redfett and co-authors, various other people here, have written a lot. We've known for a long time that standard DSG models where the expectations hypothesis holds, it's very hard to get volatility of long rates out of those models. With this, you get the extra sensitivity. That extra sensitivity is real rates moving. That's good, because look at this paper, at least until recently, it was not about nominal premium moving about. It's all about real rates. I'd say it's operating through the real term. That's what's happening. ECB guys saying, well, that's consistent with insurance companies and pension funds who did join in this kind of shine. But I'll show you one more picture. This is a rather nice picture. It goes back to some empirical evidence. This is not how long it's getting for ECB work. It's showing you what happens to the yield curve when you cut interest rates. So let's start over here. These are yield curve at different maturities. You're cutting the short rate by 10 basis points. And so you can see here the short rate moves by 10, the 2-year rate by 8, and this all downwards. But this is when you cut interest rates, when interest rates are positive. So you're going from 2 to 1.9. When interest rates are negative, and you cut rates, you get a much stronger effect across the whole yield curve. We can talk about why that might be true. It's consistent with our story. It's also consistent with the start, right? I think maybe more convincing. But our mechanism would exactly give you this because, oh, we have to go back a fair bit, don't we? It looks more like this one. This one. Okay, I will stop there. Abuse, questions?
Thanks a lot. So, comments or questions for people who are at home or in the room?
I just have one.
Yeah.
Following up with my comment at the beginning about variance in Vila and one your mechanism. It doesn't seem too much, but maybe like it would be interesting to see, even though like to get the positive calculation to make some sort of force rate between the two mechanisms to see what comes out of that. Like basically like finding the old structure and basically see what happens. Very good. Technically.
So yes, I suppose there's different horse races you could imagine.
Yeah.
So there's the empirical horse race, which come back to the earlier question of, we could just take that equation and say, does it look like that's positive or negative? But there's also a horse race which you were kind of alluding to, which could be a theoretical horse race where you were building both these mechanisms. I think that's sort of interesting, but in a way, sort of not, because what's going to happen is you're going to get. So it is interesting. I'd be to say it's not. You're going to get our insurance fund is going to sit like that, and then you're going to get some other guy doing something who's going to have another one of these with a different coefficient, and it's ultimately going to be a question of how much money this guy has and how much money the other guy has and how big that coefficient is relative to that.
Yeah, I was thinking that related to Ernesto's question in the sense that how much the important players in the financial market, or this kind in particular are insurance funds, and maybe like in terms of policy question, it would be useful to know like the policy of the.
So I agree. I mean, one of the things here is that paper by Ellison and Domansky has a lot of stuff, basically telling you about what's the market capitalization of insurance funds and relative to other, and making the case for this being an important segment of the market. We haven't done any of that. It's kind of missing here. That okay, you said if this guy exists and they behave like this is what happens. But do they really exist? Maybe.
So that there was empirical evidence on the amplification mechanism.
Yeah.
Right? Do you know if that amplification mechanism has changed over time? Because that could relate to your amplification slide, in which you had the shorters were increasing. So if it has increased over time, that would give you that would provide evidence, indirect evidence from your mechanisms, right?
It would, although I suppose what you really mean is how that hasn't increased as interest rates have fallen.
Right, you have that.
So it's not really over time.
Yeah, exactly.
There's no particular reason to think.
Yeah.
But then that comes back to that very final picture I showed you. That is showing you very different effects when you are at low interest rates than at
Right, and you don't have the participation of the different intermediaries over there. Because what you showed at the beginning was that you had more insurance companies buying long-term bonds.
Yeah.
So if that's the case, that you have here that the mechanism goes to the insurance companies. So if you put all of that together.
So I'm saying that the end product is right here,
Exactly.
and you're saying, I want to see that behind the mask, there is some portfolios moving.
Yeah.
Now that's probably a good comment. I don't dispute that.
But in that picture, they're probably not the same shot, right?
Sorry?
That those are probably not the same shot. The right one is probably the shot that usually we use outside. The fund is more like a foregone action that they the bank use when the rates very close to zero.
I don't think so, because I think they've done it properly. So I did not do it, but yeah, I mean, why don't I shoot myself in the foot by saying how I interpret this? I think this is learning about where the lower bound is. And so imagine interest rates are low, they're negative, and at that point you cover even more. That tells the market a lot about where the central bank thinks the zero low bound is. And so probably introduces greater downside risk, having seen them go. I think that's what's happening here. Maybe as well as what we're doing. And it'd be great to unpick that kind of thing. Whereas, when you at 6% and you apply 10%, it doesn't take anything about a zero low bound. When that happens, whereas here, I think that's what's going on.
Anyone else?
So I'll ask a couple of things very, very quickly, hopefully. One is that you show us everything about interest rate cuts. Is there any reason to believe that the Fed is going to be asymmetric for interest rate raises?
No.
So it's going to be exactly
So to restate that, what that means is when you start raising interest rates from a low level, it's going to have a big effect.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the second one is that in the model, monetary policy shocks are pure monetary policy, is well-defined monetary policy shock. In reality, monetary policy surprises tend to have more confounding effects. Let's say the monetary policy shock itself, plus some information about the future. Yeah. So if you have these two things combined, it's going to how you show us may change. For instance, a monetary policy rate cut may mean that the central bank wants to stimulate the economy, or but also tells information about that the probably returns in the future are going to get lower because there's growth or whatever. Is there a way to use the machinery?
I would say yes, but in some ways, again, that could all be expectations component. So you could imagine like an agent who is rationally interpreting the central bank, doing all that signaling and whatever. There will be a response of the yield curve that's consistent with the expectations hypothesis. And that may involve all sorts of Kalman filtering or inference. Whatever you put in here, then these are going to layer on top. Okay. There's no reason to think these would be different because this has been inferred from, say, some imperfect information kind of world. Because at the end of the day, is pretty mechanical. It's stuck with trading, with pricing up at 10-year rate. So it really only cares about what the 10-year rate is. And it doesn't care about why that's determined or what that's going to do in the future. It's just that, damn, with the 10-year rate moved, I need to change my asset holdings. Okay.